Welcome back to the Story of Liberty with Dr. Marshall Foster and theologian Dan Williamson. I'm your host, John Bona. We're talking about what should government's role be in regard to our nation's economic system. And, of course, as Christians, we look to the Bible because it tells us, it reinforces a system in which property belongs to individuals, not the government. Of course, we know the government will need property for certain things, military bases, government offices, streets, highways, things like that. But private property belongs to individuals. And we see this implied right in the Ten Commandments. For example, the 8th commandment says, "You shall not steal." That assumes that human beings will own property that belongs to them individually and not to other people. I shouldn't steal my neighbor's ox or his donkey because it belongs to my neighbor, not me, and not to anyone else. And, of course, the opposite of this is what socialism and communism teaches and enforces. That could be summed up with a single sentence: the abolition of private property. And one reason why socialism and communism, and I don't see any difference, I know there's an argument about that, but to me they're the same. They're incredibly dehumanizing. And because when private property is abolished, the government controls all economic activity. And when the government controls all economic activity, it controls what you could buy, where you will live, what job you will have, and what you're allowed to train for, whether you like it or not, where you're going to go to school, and how much you will earn. It essentially controls all of life, and human liberty is destroyed. Now, we have seen many examples where socialism enslaves people and destroys human freedom. And in effect, Marshall, I've heard you use this example, that an entire nation becomes one huge prison. Marshall, what do you think?
That's right.
Go ahead.
Well, that's right. In fact, all of Europe, in essence, was one huge prison, and the rest of the world, in terms of totalitarian dictators, using, whether it be socialism that was talked about all the way back to Plato and the ancient Greeks, where everything was owned by the state, and that the children were owned by the state. That goes all the way back to Plato, but you can track it all the way through Europe, where the tyrants controlled everything, and it's one of the reasons the Pilgrims came to America. The reason people immigrated to this country was for liberty, both spiritual liberty, and they wanted economic liberty. They wanted to own their own land, which was very difficult in England. It was almost impossible in much of Europe. And so they came to America. When they came here, because of the adventurers that put up the money, the Pilgrims actually had to live under a socialistic or communistic structure for the first 2 years that they were here, because the contract that they had signed made them work 6 days for the group that had put up part of the money, and then 1 day for themselves, and they ended up having to work in common land. Well, that resulted in starvation the first 2 years, and when William Bradford became governor in the spring of 1623, 2 years after they had arrived, he said, "If a man shall not work, he shall not eat." We must go back to the biblical principles. Don't we know that these other philosophies don't work? And so every man was given a plot of land, and he had to work that land by himself. In other words, not everybody just working together commonly, which means the hard workers work and everybody else sits around and watches them work. And so the result was great prosperity exploded in the summer of 1623. And that was really the beginning of modern free enterprise as we see it in America, which is built upon the biblical foundations, like you were saying, John, of private ownership. 4 of the 10 commandments deal specifically with private property and the conception of this free enterprise system. You're not to steal another man's wife. You're not to steal another man's life by murdering him. You're not to lust after his goods, or be jealous for them, which is the whole socialist system is built upon a jealousy towards someone else's goods. So can't you get the government to take it from them and give it to me? That is totally anti-biblical. The Pilgrims realized that. And so when we talk about America's strength economically, practically everyone, even as an economist, and I got my degree in economics, the thing that even socialist economists had to admit that early America and all the way through the 19th and early 20th century, most productive individuals the world has ever known, and the reason for that was the Puritan work ethic or the Christian work ethic. And what did they mean by the Puritan work ethic? Well, it was a series of principles simply built from the Scriptures that taught people how to economically live. If you had this internal character, John, that we were talking about, then, and you realize that the Bible is the overseer of your life, then you are a steward because God has given you this free enterprise to steward it. And so you don't waste resources, you don't destroy the land, you build and develop, and you're creative, and you voluntarily work because you know you're going to be held accountable for your work by God. A man shall 6 days shall he labor, 1 day shall he rest. You realize that you have a calling from God. You have to do things like care for your family. A man who does not care for his own is worse than an infidel. You realize that you're accountable for charity. You realize that you must be honest in your dealings. The biggest problem in business today is the theft of employees from employers. It's a $300 billion a year problem in America. Why? Because people are no longer honest in their dealings, and they're stealing other people's money of the companies that they work for. Same with savings. A person who has a biblical worldview or has this Puritan work ethic will save rather than spend. And so the idea is he will earn more than he spends, and he will save the rest of it. Why? Because he has a view toward the inheritance of his children, and so he is optimistic only in the sense that he is pouring his life's work into preparing for the next generation so that they will have a head start. That's the Christian way of building an economy. And it's built upon private charity, it's built upon private industrialness, not upon government largesse.
And of course, Marshall, you're lining us right up to talk about the Declaration of Independence, right? We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The first time they wrote that word, pursuit of happiness, the word was actually private property. But in looking at the word private property, they thought it was too limited. So they want it to be bigger, pursuit of happiness, which is the work of your hands. No one can control that. The creativity of your mind, the capital that you might have, or the property that you might have, they're all yours, and no government or entity can take that from you. And thus we get some of the concepts of getting a, what's the word for you've invented something, a patent. The whole patent system is structured around these concepts that come right out of the Bible through the Puritan work ethic, right up through the Declaration of Independence. And, it secures for us, or is supposed to, that protection which the government is supposed to be protecting. That's one of the things they're supposed to do, is protect our rights to that pursuit of happiness. And the minute those rights are permeated by the government or mobocracy, the first ones that struggle, of course, are families, because the families are the first line of defense in that economic system. And when you start to strip away their property rights, their creativity rights, their capital rights, and the work of their hands, you will slowly but surely have an apathetic public that says, well, why should I work any harder? It all goes someplace else. And it's the wrong way to think. I know in our own home, we work 6 days, we rest 1. Saturday is not a rest day. That's a work day, just like a Monday through Friday, and we've our own children. So, you're just, it's a great stepping stone. Private property is the cornerstone.
And I think it's a regular tendency of human governments is to seek and take control of more and more of the property of a nation that God intends to be owned and controlled by private individuals. And Dan, you mentioned the Declaration, those seminal passages that open with maybe the most important line that, we hold these truths to be self-evident. They're grounded in reason, self-evident tradition of natural law, that there's a higher law of right and wrong from which we're to derive human law. And, even Samuel, it just popped in my mind here when I think about when Samuel warned the people when they demanded a king. And Samuel told them real clear the evils that would be imposed upon them by the king. And he used the word take, 5 times, that, okay, you can have a king, but he's going to take, and take some more from you. He's going to confiscate things for his own use. And, of course, you know the story. God said, well, they're not really turning against you, Samuel. They're turning against me. Give them what they want. And the will of the people was fulfilled. But, Marshall, I know...
Take them away. Right, he would take away their private property, and he would take a lot more than the tithe, which God demands. They would take. Now we've got a government that's taking 40 to 50% of the wealth of the people, and they would also run their sons and daughters, their sons in front of his chariots, meaning foreign wars and wars all over. Wherever the king wants to take you, you have to go, and who put your daughters to work in your soup kitchens. The reason that so many mothers who would like to be home with their children have to work is because the way they've inflated the housing market and inflating things, we can't live on one income anymore. So people are going out and both adults are working just to make a living, to pay the mortgage on their house, and it is destroying the family, is what it's doing. And so we've got to get back to these principles and understand that this is the foundation for success. It always has been. It always will be. And I think the American people are beginning to wake up to this. And the problem that we face is that the churches, and I have to come, and I'm an ordained minister myself, and I speak in churches all throughout America, and I love the church, but I have to admit that the pastors, for the most part, have failed utterly in preaching from the pulpit the absolute biblical principles of free enterprise and Christian enterprise and how people can be successful if they follow the Bible's principles. We have ignored this, and we've talked about all kinds of other things, but when it comes to government or economics or issues of our day, the pulpits have not been aflame for righteousness like they were in early America. In early America, they talked about these issues, and they talked about hard currency, and that's why it was built into our Constitution. Just weights and measures in the Bible. We wouldn't have an inflated currency today that is driving us into bankruptcy if we simply went back to a gold standard in which the currency was always a set value. These are biblical principles, and the people in America have got to awaken to the fact that they must have principles that are so deeply embedded that go back to the truths that are universal, that they're willing to die for them. Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death." He was willing to die for the principles he knew were true. I'm afraid too many Americans simply have opinions, and people with opinions are easily controlled.
And you know, Marshall, I have to admit, I wonder how many kitchen tables have sat around Proverbs 11, a false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. I wonder how many kitchen tables have really talked about how our long-term generational savings have been just decimated by the hidden tax of inflation and the false weight and measure of our monetary system. I mean, I even was reading the history of our little township that I live in. And in the 1840s and 1860s, when it was a very prosperous little town getting itself set up, one of the number one offices that they appointed was the person in charge of just weights and measures. They actually checked all the grain and the coinage to make sure it was all fair trade and that the weights and the measures of the coins, that there was no dross in it, that it really was a bushel of wheat, it really was a gold coin. It was so important that they followed those biblical principles, and they literally were their own little township, building their own bridges and roads, managing their own school systems, the whole shooting match. And today, I wonder if it's even discussed at most kitchen tables, what does that verse really mean when we hold a dollar bill up that, you know, in, like I've taught my children, in 1880, a gold piece bought you a full suit, clothes, hat, socks, boots, the whole works. Today, that same equivalent in Federal Reserve debtor notes wouldn't even buy you dinner at a restaurant. And yet the same piece of gold, the same standard piece of gold today would buy you a very nice suit, hat, gloves, boots, tie, etc. It's a simple lesson, but it shows how that just weight and measure was not maintained. And so today, you're right. We've got people trying to make ends meet, wondering what happened to their $10 an hour, $20 an hour, $30 an hour. Why can't it buy the same? We just didn't lose $1 a gallon at the gas pump. we're losing value somewhere else, and that's because there's no just weight and measure. There's a hidden tax called inflation, and that ties back to our debt situation and printing money that really we shouldn't be printing.